The sky over Beacon Hill was thick with dark clouds, so heavy they seemed to press the trees in the Carter family's sprawling garden down to the ground. The imposing Victorian mansion stood like a sentinel, isolated from the world by miles of dense forest. Sarah Harper, arriving for yet another shift, looked at the facade with the same discomfort as always. Despite its grandeur, the house had an oppressive aura. It felt, in a strange way, alive, breathing the same heavy air that weighed on Sarah's chest every time she passed through those gates. The rain started soon after Sarah parked her car on the stone path leading to the main entrance. She ran, shielding herself as best she could, her shoes making muffled splashes in the puddles already forming. Inside the house, the sound of the storm seemed amplified, echoing through the wide, cold hallways, with no one around to break the gloomy silence. Already accustomed to the solitude, Sarah followed her usual route to Margaret Carter's room. Each step she took down the immaculately clean corridors seemed to echo, her footsteps bouncing off walls adorned with family portraits and ancient tapestries displaying the wealth and power of the Carters. She passed these decorations daily, but most of the time, she avoided looking at the eyes in the paintings. There was something unsettling about how the Carter ancestors seemed to watch her, as if judging her presence there. When she pushed open the heavy door to Margaret's room, the sound of the rain was replaced by another familiar noise, the beeping of life support machines, regulating the steady rhythm that kept Margaret tethered between life and death. The room was spacious and well-decorated, with large windows covered by heavy curtains that stifled any natural light. Everything felt suffocating. The air was thick, not just with the weather, but with the very atmosphere, a space that had been Margaret Carter's only world for months. Sarah approached the bed, her face reflected in the gleam of the medical equipment. The figure of Margaret, lying in absolute silence, looked fragile, so different from the woman she had once been, according to the few who still remembered her as she was. Her body was motionless, but well cared for, wrapped in expensive sheets. Her skin was pale, her face expressionless, her eyes closed for so long that Sarah wondered if they would ever open again. "It's raining a lot out there today, Mrs. Carter," Sarah said softly, more to herself than to the patient. She always spoke to Margaret, even knowing it was futile. "Were you always a fan of rainy weather?" "I'm not sure, but it seems like the rain really likes this house." She smiled briefly, though the gesture was sad, almost resigned. That was what Sarah did. Talked about trivial things. Something inside her told her that Margaret, somehow, could hear. Over the months of care, Sarah had developed a strange habit of holding one-sided conversations with the patient, a desperate attempt to fill the silence that surrounded her every day. The Carter mansion, located on the outskirts of Concord, seemed to have a life of its own, but it was a cold, distant life. From the outside, its imposing columns, wrought iron balconies, and tall windows projected what any outsider would see as a symbol of power. But inside, the atmosphere was different. The silence in the house had disturbed Sarah from the very beginning. She often wondered how David Carter could live there, day after day, surrounded by memories of a woman who was technically still alive, yet completely absent. David Carter. His name echoed in her mind as she adjusted the wires attached to Margaret's body. David's presence in the house was as constant as the absence of life in Margaret. He visited his wife every day, always in the late afternoon, his expression worn and grim. He would watch her in silence, as if his mere presence at her bedside was enough to sustain the hope that one day his wife would open her eyes. Sarah knew there was more to their relationship than just sadness. David always seemed uncomfortable in his wife's presence. Something in his gaze, a mix of guilt and despair, unsettled her. Though a husband's desperation was common in such situations, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that David was hiding something. The house, with its empty rooms and vast corridors, hid secrets as well. Dr. Morgan, the physician responsible for Margaret, visited the mansion twice a week. A middle-aged man with stern features and few words, Dr. Morgan conducted his examinations efficiently, but there was something about him that made Sarah suspicious. He always seemed to avoid discussing details about Margaret's progress. His reports were vague, offering no clear diagnosis or prognosis. Sarah, on the other hand, noticed small details that might easily be overlooked, like the occasional twitch in Margaret's muscles or the slight flutter of her eyelids that she had observed at times. Part of Sarah insisted that Margaret was trying to communicate in some way, but Dr. Morgan always dismissed her observations as involuntary reflexes. Sarah was finishing adjusting the machines when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps down the hall. David had arrived. With each step, it seemed he carried the weight of the house and what remained of his marriage. His slumped shoulders and tired expression spoke more than his words ever could. When he entered the room, the rain outside seemed to intensify, as if the weather were responding to the tension that hung within those walls. He didn't look at Sarah. His eyes were fixed on Margaret, as always. He approached the bed, moving with the precision of someone who had repeated the same actions countless times. He sat in the leather armchair he kept beside the bed, holding his wife's hand with a reverence that was almost tender. Sarah kept her distance, watching David from afar as he held Margaret's hand. There was something deeply unsettling about the scene. She wasn't sure if it was the lack of emotion on his face or the complete absence of dialogue. David always did the same thing. He would sit there, in absolute silence, staring at his wife as if waiting for her to respond. "Any changes today?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Sarah hesitated, remembering the slight tremor she had noticed earlier in Margaret's fingers. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a reflex. "Nothing significant," she replied. "Her vitals are stable, but no real changes." David nodded, but his face remained expressionless. Something about his demeanor disturbed her deeply. He seemed frustrated. Sarah knew it was hard for him, and for a moment she felt tempted to say something comforting, but the words died in her throat. There wasn't much she could offer beyond professional care and attention. I don't know how much longer this can go on," David murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. His voice carried a palpable anguish, and Sarah felt a pang in her chest. He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair as he looked at Margaret with an expression of contained despair. The silence returned to the room, broken only by the sound of the medical equipment and the rain still beating against the windows. David rose abruptly and without another word, left the room, leaving Sarah alone once again. The nurse watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something deeply wrong in that house, and with each of David's visits, that feeling only grew stronger. After David left, the silence in the room felt more oppressive than ever. As Sarah finished checking the monitors and tidying up the belongings around the bed, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small drawer next to the bedside table, slightly ajar. The contents of the drawer were hidden beneath old papers and a few photographs, but at the bottom, something caught her eye, a small black leather notebook, worn with age. Carefully, Sarah picked up the notebook. A chill ran down her spine as she touched the cold, worn material. It was undoubtedly a personal item of Margaret's, but something about the way it was hidden suggested that it wasn't meant to be found. Sarah glanced around as if afraid someone might be watching her. She felt a strange sense of guilt, as if she were about to betray the trust of a woman who couldn't defend herself. She opened the diary, and in the first few pages, she found disjointed sentences, random thoughts. But one sentence made her stop, her heart racing as she read the words, "I think someone wants to hurt me." The phrase, scrawled urgently, seemed to vibrate before Sarah's eyes. Her body tensed. Who did Margaret think wanted to harm her? Sarah quickly flipped through the following pages, her breath quickening. The words became increasingly difficult to understand, as if Margaret had written them in haste, perhaps disturbed by something she feared. Another phrase appeared amidst the confused text. Linda isn't who I thought she was. Linda? Margaret's personal assistant? Sarah knew little about Linda Hastings. Other than that, she had a close relationship with David and was responsible for managing the family's affairs. But what did that mean? Why did Margaret distrust her own assistant? Sarah closed the diary with a snap, her fingers trembling. Something was very wrong in that house. And for the first time, she began to suspect that Margaret Carter's condition wasn't just the result of a tragic accident. The rain, which had been a constant background hum, turned into a storm. Outside, thunder echoed through the mansion's halls, reverberating against the ancient walls as if time itself were growing furious. Sarah Harper, with Margaret Carter's diary still in her trembling hands, felt the weight of her discovery. She couldn't stop reading those urgent, scrawled words, "Someone wants to hurt me." It was as if each page contained a silent scream, a desperate attempt to communicate. She looked at Margaret, still lying motionless in bed, her blonde hair spread out on the pillow. What was hidden behind that accident? Sarah wondered how many times she had looked at the patient, never imagining that perhaps Margaret wasn't just a passive victim of a tragic mishap. Something more was happening, and whatever it was still waiting to be uncovered. Slowly closing the diary, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Margaret's presence there, immobilized and vulnerable, now seemed more fragile than ever. Despite all the medical technology surrounding her, it felt as if Margaret was completely alone, defenseless against something that might be closer than anyone imagined. Something that could be inside that very house. The Carters were not just wealthy, they were one of the most influential families in the region. Owners of multiple properties and a fortune built over generations, the Carter name was synonymous with prestige. David Carter, though not the typical arrogant magnate, carried the weight of that responsibility. He was a man who had grown up surrounded by power, but now he seemed adrift, unable to cope with the tragedy that had befallen his family. Sarah, though merely a nurse, couldn't help but feel the impact of that power. The house, despite its expensive furnishings and adorned walls, had an oppressive atmosphere. Everything there seemed to remind her of Margaret, from the imposing portraits in the corridors to the faint scent of lavender, which Sarah imagined had once been the patient's favorite perfume. Margaret was everywhere, and yet she was nowhere. However, David was an enigma. Since Sarah had started working there, she had noticed his strange behavior. He appeared and disappeared at unpredictable hours, and when he was in the house, his visits to his wife were filled with silence and frustration. There were no tears, no expressions of affection, just a blank, heavy stare. To Sarah, it seemed as though David was trapped between the duties of a husband and an invisible guilt that consumed him. Then there was Linda Hastings, Margaret's personal assistant, whose mention in the diary had set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. Linda was always polite, always efficient, but there was something about her that didn't quite fit. She was responsible for managing the family's affairs while Margaret was incapacitated, and that included handling large sums of money, investments, and properties. Sarah had never seen Linda express any genuine emotion. It was as if she was always wearing a mask of impeccable professionalism. Could Linda really be dangerous? Sarah tried to push the thoughts away. But as she looked at the diary, she knew she couldn't ignore Margaret's warnings. That night, after David had left, Sarah sat alone in the room, in a chair near Margaret's bed. The storm outside had grown stronger, with the wind howling as if it wanted to force its way inside. The nurse held the diary, flipping through the pages, rereading the same disturbing passages over and over. Margaret's words were fragmented, but there was a pattern, a growing suspicion, a paranoia that Sarah was beginning to understand. Margaret mentioned Dr. Walker, the family's former physician, who had been replaced shortly before the accident. He had started giving her new medications, and though he claimed they were to help her deal with stress, Margaret had begun to distrust his true intentions. In several entries, she described how she felt increasingly strange after taking the pills, as if her mind were being clouded by a fog. "I feel like I'm drowning in myself," one passage read. "Dr. Walker keeps saying it's normal, that the meds will help me, but I don't believe him. And Linda? Linda is always nearby, watching." The mention of Linda was brief, but consistent. Margaret clearly felt that something wasn't right with her assistant, though she never explicitly stated what she thought Linda was doing. Still, the suspicions were there, as clear as day. And now, with Margaret in a vegetative state, no one knew for sure what had really happened. Sarah closed the diary, feeling a weight on her chest. Something was very wrong, and she needed to figure out what it was. But how? She was just a nurse, with no power or influence in that house. Her duties were limited to taking care of Margaret, but something inside her pushed her to investigate further. Whatever had happened before the accident was still in play. The next day, Dr. Morgan made his regular visit to the house. He arrived promptly, as always, carrying his brown leather case and wearing his cold, calculating expression. Sarah had never liked him, though he was a respected physician. There was something about the way he spoke, always so distant and technical, that made her feel insignificant. As if to him, Margaret was just another clinical case, devoid of any human dimension. Sarah watched as he conducted his routine checkup. He examined Margaret's vitals, adjusted the machines, and made notes on his tablet, without even glancing at the nurse. Sarah remained silent, but something inside her was bubbling up, a need to confront him with her suspicions. "Dr. Morgan," she began hesitantly. The doctor didn't look up. "What is it, Sarah?" His voice was impersonal, as if he were bored with any conversation that didn't involve numbers and diagnoses. I've noticed some strange things with Mrs. Carter," she said, carefully choosing her words. Small movements like contractions, and sometimes her eyes seem to respond to stimuli. I think she's trying to communicate." Dr. Morgan finally looked at her, but his eyes showed no surprise nor any trace of genuine interest. He sighed, closing the tablet with a firm gesture. "Those reflexes are normal in vegetative patients. They're involuntary reactions of the body. They don't mean she's conscious in any way." Sarah felt frustration rising to the surface. "But what is?" "There is no but, Sarah," he interrupted, his voice as cold as ice. "Margaret Carter is in an irreversible vegetative state. Don't create false hope, not for yourself or her husband." She pressed her lips together, holding back the response she wanted to give. Dr. Morgan always acted as though he were the only one who understood what was happening, and any questioning was immediately dismissed. He didn't care to look more closely, and that left Sarah feeling uneasy. If Margaret was truly trying to communicate, no one but Sarah was paying attention. Dr. Morgan made his final notes, then got up and headed toward the door. "You're a good nurse, Sarah," he said, in a tone that sounded more like a reprimand than a compliment. "Keep doing your job and leave the medicine to the doctors." And with that, he left, leaving Sarah alone in the room once again. She looked at Margaret, her own sadness and uncertainty reflected in the patient's pale face. Sarah approached, holding Margaret's hand for a moment. She knew she wasn't imagining things. There was something more, something being ignored or hidden. And she wasn't going to stop until she found out what it was. Later that day, when David Carter arrived for his usual visit, Sarah was waiting for him in the hallway. Margaret's diary still fresh in her mind. She needed to tell him what she had found. He needed to know that something was wrong, that his wife might be in danger, even in her current state. David entered, as always, with his heavy demeanor, his tired eyes. He looked older by the day, the weight of the situation slowly destroying him. When he saw her in the hallway, a slight confusion crossed his face. "Sarah, is something wrong?" She hesitated for a moment but knew she had to be direct. "I found something, Mr. Carter. A diary from your wife. And I think you should see it." David stared at her, his expression shifting quickly from surprise to slight irritation. "A diary? Margaret didn't keep a diary. I found it in her room, and there are some things. Well, I think you need to see for yourself," Sarah insisted, offering him the notebook. David took the diary reluctantly, opening it. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression turned to one of shock and disbelief. He closed the diary abruptly and looked at Sarah, now visibly uncomfortable. What exactly are you implying, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low but filled with tension. "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Carter," she said firmly, but Margaret seemed worried about someone. About Linda. And maybe about Dr. Walker too. I don't know what it means, but I think it's important." David sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. I don't know. I didn't even know Margaret had these concerns. I always thought the accident was just an accident." Sarah looked at him, sensing the despair in his voice. But at the same time, something in his posture seemed to hide more than he was willing to admit. "I don't know either, but we can't ignore this. Something is happening, and I think Mrs. Carter was trying to warn us." David nodded slowly, his somber eyes fixed on the diary. "You're right. We need to look into this. We need to find out the truth." David Carter's words echoed in Sarah Harper's mind as she returned to Margaret Carter's room that same night. The promise of finding the truth felt heavy, a burden that now the two of them shared. Since the moment she had handed the diary to David, something inside Sarah had shifted. Before, she was just a nurse trying to do her job as best she could. Now, she was involved in a much more dangerous and complex web than she had ever imagined. The mansion's walls seemed to close in around her as she walked through the hallways. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was hiding a dark secret, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. The rain outside had lessened, but the sky remained dense and dark. In the absolute silence of the night, only the sound of her footsteps echoed on the old wooden floorboards. When she reached Margaret's room, Sarah paused for a moment, looking at the still figure of the patient in the bed. Now, more than ever, she was convinced that Margaret knew more than anyone there imagined. And if the diary was an effort to reveal the truth before something had stopped her, it was a deliberate clue left behind for someone to find. Sarah felt a chill run through her. As she approached the bed, a slight doubt formed in her mind. What would she do if Margaret really woke up? What could happen when the secrets finally came to light? In the weeks that followed the discovery of the diary, Sarah and David began to watch more closely for any small signs that Margaret exhibited. At first, the sporadic movements Sarah had noticed in Margaret's fingers were easy to dismiss as involuntary reflexes. But now that there was a real suspicion that something more was at play, every movement seemed loaded with meaning. Sarah began testing stimuli. She would talk to Margaret directly, asking simple questions and watching for any kind of physical response. "Margaret, can you hear me?" she'd ask, almost in a whisper, her eyes fixed on the patient's fingers, looking for any slight movement. There were moments when Sarah swore she saw a reaction, like a small twitch, a subtle blink of the eyelids. Other times, Margaret seemed as distant as ever. It was hard to stay optimistic. Everyone around, from Dr. Morgan to the other medical staff who occasionally visited, was convinced that Margaret was irreversibly lost in her vegetative state. But Sarah knew something wasn't right. Things didn't add up. Not after what she had read in the diary. However, the real turning point came one seemingly ordinary afternoon when Sarah was about to finish her shift. She was adjusting the equipment next to Margaret's bed when something caught her attention. Movement. It wasn't just a twitch. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. The movement came from beneath Margaret's eyelids, a visible flutter. The patient's eyes, which had been closed the entire time Sarah had known her, seemed to be struggling to open. Sarah leaned in, feeling her pulse quicken. "Margaret," she called softly but urgently. She grabbed the patient's hand, waiting for something more to happen. And then, with agonizing slowness, Margaret's eyes opened slightly. It was just for a second, a glimpse of confused, clouded eyes, but it was enough to make Sarah step back, completely stunned. Margaret Carter was waking up. That night, Sarah could hardly sleep. What had happened was a clear sign that Margaret was starting to respond, and that meant time was running out. If someone in the house, whether Linda or Dr. Walker, was involved in keeping Margaret in that state, they would certainly notice the change and take steps to ensure she didn't recover. The next day, Sarah told David what had happened. He listened intently, but there was a shadow of skepticism in his eyes. "She really opened her eyes? Are you sure?" He seemed to want to believe, but at the same time he was visibly exhausted from months of false hope. "Yes, it was just for a second, but she opened her eyes," Sarah insisted, feeling the urgency in her own voice. "I'm sure, David, something's happening. Margaret is responding, and if what's in the diary is true, she could be in danger." David was silent for a moment, rubbing his tired face with his hands. "Then what do we do? If Dr. Walker and Linda are involved, how do we prove it? How do we protect her?" Sarah didn't have all the answers, but she knew they couldn't continue to be passive. "We need help," she said finally. "Someone from outside, someone who isn't involved with the hospital or the family." David looked at her, hesitant, but finally nodded. "I know someone, a private investigator who's worked for our family before. If there's something wrong, he'll find it." 2 weeks later, Bill O'Connor entered the scene. He was a middle-aged man with stubble and a tired look that indicated he had seen more than anyone in his line of work should. Bill was direct, professional, and had a solid reputation. He came recommended by a friend of David's, and though he was known for handling more ordinary cases, it was clear that he understood this was different. At first, Bill seemed skeptical of what Sarah and David presented to him. A vegetative state, a suspicious accident, a diary that hinted at conspiracies. It seemed like something out of a movie. But when he started digging into Margaret's medical and financial records, his expression began to change. "The first thing I noticed was the discrepancy in the medications," he said during one of his visits to the Carter mansion. He was sitting in the kitchen, going over the documents he had managed to recover. "What Margaret was taking before the accident has nothing to do with what's being administered now." Sarah frowned, leaning in to listen more closely. "What do you mean?" "I was able to access the old records. The doctor treating her before, Dr. Walker, started giving her a series of medications that don't make sense for her condition. It was as if he was preparing her for something like this. Keeping the body functioning, but the mind, well, that was being destroyed." David sat still, his hands clenched on the table. "And Linda?" Bill shrugged. "She was directly involved. I'm not sure to what extent, but Linda was signing documents, managing Margaret's funds while she was hospitalized. She had full control over the finances." The room fell silent as the three of them processed the gravity of the situation. Linda and Dr. Walker, working together, seemed to be manipulating Margaret in some sort of scheme involving money, and, according to the medical records, also her health. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. This was much bigger than she had imagined. Sarah began watching Linda Hastings with new eyes. Every gesture, every word seemed loaded with suspicion. Linda was methodical, always polite, but Sarah noticed a coldness in her eyes when she talked about Margaret. Even when David was around, Linda maintained a perfect professionalism, as if Margaret were just another responsibility on her to-do list. Nothing about her showed any genuine concern. However, something began to change in Linda. With Bill O'Connor investigating discreetly, Sarah noticed that Linda was becoming more cautious, almost as if she knew someone was starting to catch on to her. She began avoiding long interactions with Sarah, appearing only when absolutely necessary and always in a hurry to leave. Sarah knew Linda suspected something, and that time was running out. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the hills, Sarah and David met with Bill in a small room in the mansion, far from curious ears. Bill had gathered enough evidence to confront Linda and Dr. Walker. The money diverted from Margaret's accounts, the altered medical records, and the suspicious payments were all concrete proof that both were, in some way, manipulating the situation. "We have enough to bring them down," Bill said as he spread the documents across the table. "But we need to be careful. We don't know how far this goes. If we confront Linda now, she might try to run, or worse, do something to silence Margaret once and for all." Sarah looked at David, seeing the tension in his face. The decision he would make in the next few hours could change everything. "We need to protect her," she said firmly. "We need to act." David agreed, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "And if Margaret doesn't recover? What if it's too late?" Sarah shook her head. "We can't think like that. Margaret is trying to come back, I know it. We can't leave her alone now." The silence filled the room as the shadows of the night began to envelop the house. Everyone knew they were about to cross a point of no return. David Carter, with clenched fists, stared at the documents spread across the table. The numbers, the records, the illicit payments, all pointed to a cruel conspiracy against his wife. It was hard to believe that someone like Linda Hastings, whom he had trusted for so many years, could be involved. Even more shocking was the revelation that Margaret's trusted physician, Dr. Walker, had also played a part in something so sinister. Sarah Harper watched David closely. He seemed torn between anger and despair, his face etched with the pain he had been carrying for months. But there was something deeper in his expression that night. Something deeper, as if a greater truth was looming. Something he feared as much as the loss of his wife. Bill O'Connor, the private investigator, sat in the farthest chair, his arms crossed. The exhaustion was evident on his face, but his eyes remained sharp. He knew the moment of action was close. They had waited long enough, gathered enough evidence. Now the question was simple: how and when to deliver the final blow. "We have enough to bring them down, David. There's no doubt about it," Bill said, breaking the heavy silence. "But we have to be careful. If Linda and Walker realize we're close, they could act before we can stop them." David nodded slowly, but didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on the papers, but his mind seemed distant, deep in thought. Sarah observed him closely. She could feel the pressure building, the urgency of their actions. If they didn't move quickly, Margaret might never truly wake up, and those responsible would remain free. That same night, after the tense meeting with Bill, Sarah returned to Margaret Carter's room. The house was steeped in an unsettling silence, and the sound of Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. When she entered the room, the familiar sound of life support machines greeted her with a monotonous rhythm, almost comforting in its regularity. There was Margaret, as always, motionless under the white satin sheets, her face serene, oblivious to everything happening around her. But Sarah knew that this was only the surface. Something was changing. She could feel it in the air, a sort of silent energy circulating through the room. Margaret's body, although still in a vegetative state, was beginning to respond in ways that science couldn't fully explain. "Margaret," Sarah murmured as she adjusted one of the electrodes on her patient's arm. "I know you're there. I know you're trying to come back," She held Margaret's cold hand, remembering the slight contractions she had noticed in the past few weeks. Now, more than ever, Sarah needed a response. Some kind of sign that Margaret was fighting to escape the abyss she had been thrown into. "If you can hear me, try to move. Anything," Sarah whispered, hope pulsing in every word. And then, as if her words were a catalyst, Margaret's fingers twitched slightly. It was such a subtle movement that it could easily have gone unnoticed, but Sarah felt it. She froze, her heart racing. There was no mistaking it. Margaret was conscious. Sarah knelt beside the bed, leaning closer. "Margaret, you need to help me. If you're trapped somehow, if something is stopping you from waking up, try to show me more." Margaret's fingers twitched again, this time more noticeably. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. After months of caring for this woman, seeing her as a shadow of who she once was, Sarah finally felt that she was connecting with her, beyond words. She knew what she had to do. She needed to confront Dr. Morgan immediately. There was something more going on with Margaret's medication, and the doctor wasn't being transparent. Each new symptom, each unexpected reaction was a clear sign that Margaret was trying to break free from something deeper than a coma. Maybe what was keeping her trapped wasn't just the accident, but the intervention of people who should have been protecting her. The next day, Dr. Morgan appeared for his weekly visit, unaware that his control over the situation was about to end. He entered Margaret's room with the same cold, professional demeanor as always, making notes on his tablet without even looking at the patient with genuine concern. To him, Margaret Carter was just another lost case, something to be monitored mechanically until the situation changed, or until Margaret was no longer a concern. Sarah watched his every move, feeling her own anxiety grow. She knew she was about to cross an important line. Confronting Dr. Morgan wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about exposing his role in what had been happening to Margaret. After a few minutes, Sarah finally broke the silence. "Dr. Morgan, can we talk for a moment? There's something I need to discuss with you." The doctor lifted his eyes from the tablet, visibly irritated by the interruption to his routine. "Of course, Nurse Harper. What is it?" Sarah hesitated for only a second, feeling the weight of the tension in the room. "I've noticed certain reactions in Margaret. Small movements, contractions. They don't seem like normal reflexes." Dr. Morgan let out a heavy sigh, as if about to recite something he had said hundreds of times. "Vegetative patients can exhibit occasional motor reflexes, Sarah. We shouldn't interpret these signs as recovery." "They're not just reflexes," Sarah insisted, her tone firm. She opened her eyes, and there's something else. Since she started taking these new medications, something seems wrong. I don't think they're helping. In fact, I think they're keeping her in this state. For a brief moment, a flash of surprise crossed Dr. Morgan's face, but it was quickly replaced by his usual mask of indifference. "You're not qualified to make that kind of conclusion, nurse. I've already told you, these medications are necessary to maintain Margaret's stability." Sarah felt the heat rise in her body, a mix of anger and frustration. She knew there was more behind that cold, calculated response. Dr. Morgan was hiding something, and it was obvious he was uncomfortable with the fact that Sarah was questioning his decisions. "I have proof that these medications were introduced right after the accident, and I have records showing that they aren't appropriate for her treatment," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "And I'm not the only one who thinks so. There are others involved now, Dr. Morgan. We need to stop giving Margaret these drugs." The doctor stood still for a moment, weighing the situation. He seemed to be calculating his next words, like someone about to make an important move in a chess game. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold as ice. "You're meddling in something you don't understand, Nurse Harper. I suggest you go back to your job and leave the medicine to the professionals." Sarah didn't reply. She knew there was no point in arguing with Dr. Morgan any longer. He was involved, up to his neck, and he wouldn't admit to anything, at least not while he still had control over the situation. But Sarah wasn't about to give up. She left the room, her heart pounding, knowing they needed to act fast. In the hours that followed the encounter with Dr. Morgan, Sarah and David met with Bill O'Connor to discuss the next steps. It was clear the doctor was involved, and now it was only a matter of time before they could catch him in the act. Bill had everything prepared: recordings of conversations, documents implicating both Linda Hastings and Dr. Walker, and even financial transactions showing the transfer of money from Margaret's accounts to the parties involved. "We have enough to arrest them," Bill said, with a calm confidence that contrasted with the tension in Sarah and David. "But we need one last piece: catching Dr. Morgan in the act." David nodded, but his face showed the weight of the decision he was about to make. He was about to expose one of the most respected doctors in the region, and his longtime personal assistant. Everything he knew about his life was about to unravel. But he had no choice. He knew the only way to save Margaret was to confront those who had betrayed his trust. The trap was set. Bill ensured that a detective in disguise would be present during Dr. Morgan's next visit, ready to capture any evidence of drug manipulation or any attempt to cover up what had been done. Sarah felt a heaviness in her chest as she waited for the inevitable showdown. She knew the danger was growing. Margaret was getting closer to waking up, and those who had kept her in that state would do anything to stop it. The final storm was brewing, and no one knew for sure what would happen when it finally hit. The sound of footsteps echoed softly through the halls of the Carter mansion. The heavy curtains blocked out the natural light, leaving the house shrouded in shadows. Sarah Harper, seated on one of the sofas in the grand hall, glanced at the closed door leading to Margaret's room. The tension in the air was palpable. She knew that something decisive was about to happen. The past few days had been a time of careful, silent preparation. Bill O'Connor had ensured that everything was in place, and the plan was finally set to unfold that afternoon. Dr. Morgan's next visit would be different. It wouldn't just be the nurse and the doctor in the room. David Carter had insisted on being present, his patience worn thin. And this time, Bill would be there too, hidden, monitoring every move and recording everything. The private investigator had assured them that the final moment was near, and that they would finally have the evidence they needed. Sarah breathed deeply, trying to control the anxiety building in her chest. The image of Margaret moving her fingers, slowly opening her eyes, was still vivid in her mind. She knew that the woman was trapped in her own body, fighting to return, to fight against something that was keeping her imprisoned in silence. If they didn't act fast, everything could be lost. Shortly after 3 p.m, Dr. Morgan arrived at the mansion. His expression was the same as always: cold, calculated, with a slight arrogance that Sarah had always disliked. He was about to begin his usual routine, checking the equipment, reviewing the monitors, when David Carter entered the room. Dr. Morgan acknowledged him with a nod, showing no surprise at the husband's presence. "David, good to see you," he said, turning his attention back to the medical devices. "Things are stable, no major changes in your wife's condition." David remained silent for a moment, watching Dr. Morgan's mechanical movements as he inspected Margaret. Inside, David felt a storm of emotions: anger, pain, frustration. The man standing there checking his wife's vitals was the same person who, for months, had sabotaged any chance of her recovery. Sarah stood by the bed, watching carefully. She had noticed how Dr. Morgan always seemed too calm, a man who didn't expect to be caught. "I'd like to talk about the medications Margaret has been taking," David began, his voice controlled but filled with tension. "Sarah and I have some concerns about what's really happening." The doctor paused for a moment, adjusting the stethoscope around his neck, and turned to face David. His gaze was firm, almost as if he were reprimanding a student for asking a foolish question. I've explained this before, David. The medications are necessary to maintain her stability. They are appropriate for her condition. David crossed his arms, his gaze hardening. That's not what other specialists are saying. Sarah noticed a slight tension in Dr. Morgan's shoulders, a subtle change, but one that didn't escape her attention. The doctor hesitated for a split second before responding. I'm the one responsible for Margaret's case. Other specialists can give their opinions, but no one knows her like I do. The door opened again, and this time Bill O'Connor entered the room. He was dressed discreetly, with his phone in hand, recording everything subtly. Dr. Morgan looked at him with a hint of displeasure. Who are you? The doctor asked, his voice tinged with irritation. Bill O'Connor, the investigator replied with a slight smile. Private investigator, I'm here at David's request to make sure we're handling this situation correctly. Dr. Morgan narrowed his eyes. He was starting to realize something wasn't right. His previously composed demeanor now showed signs of discomfort. I wasn't aware that the situation required investigation, said the doctor slowly. I believe there's been a misunderstanding here. Bill shrugged, maintaining his calm tone. Maybe, but from the looks of things, there are some discrepancies in the medical and financial records. The tension in the room escalated. Sarah watched Dr. Morgan closely, her eyes trained on every detail. The doctor hadn't expected to be confronted so directly. These medications were prescribed under my supervision, Dr. Morgan said, now with a certain hardness in his voice. I'm responsible for the case. There's no reason to question my treatment. Bill pressed on, relentless. We know these drugs aren't just ineffective for Margaret's condition, they're actually prolonging her vegetative state. And we have proof that there's been financial transactions linking you to a personal account that's been receiving funds directly from Margaret's accounts. For a moment, the silence in the room was overwhelming. Dr. Morgan looked from one person to the other, trying to process the situation. He clearly hadn't expected to be caught so quickly. But before he could respond, the door opened once more, and this time Linda Hastings stepped into the room. Linda entered with a rigid posture, her eyes scanning the room as if she already knew what was happening. She stopped when she saw Bill, her eyes narrowing, slightly. Sarah noticed the brief exchange of glances between Linda and Dr. Morgan, a moment filled with silent complicity. They were both clearly aware that something had gone wrong in their plans. Is everything all right here? Linda asked, her voice soft but full of authority. Bill looked at her for a moment before answering, his tone casual but calculated. Linda, just in time. We were discussing some issues regarding Mrs. Carter's treatment. It seems there are some discrepancies in the medical and financial records. Linda showed no obvious reaction. Her expression remained controlled, almost cold. David, I told you I would handle everything while Margaret was in this condition. These rumors are baseless. You know I've always done what's best for her. David stared at her, his expression hardening even more. He approached her, keeping his voice firm. Always? Always, Linda? What about the suspicious payments? The transfers from Margaret's accounts to you and Dr. Walker? For the first time, Linda faltered. Her firm and calculated control began to crumble. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. I trusted you, David continued, his voice rising. I trusted you to take care of my wife, and now I find out that you've kept her in this state for months, siphoning money, pretending you were doing the best for her. Linda stepped back, visibly shaken by the direct accusation. David, it's not like that. I did what was necessary, what was best for the situation. Best for you, maybe, Bill interjected, stepping into the conversation as he pulled out a small recorder from his pocket. We have enough evidence now. It's no longer a question of suspicion. Linda stood silent for a few moments. Whatever control she had been holding on to collapsed under the weight of the accusations and the evidence. She knew she was cornered. Slowly, she lifted her eyes, now cold and calculating, and looked directly at David. Margaret was lost long before the accident, David, Linda began, her voice low and cold. She was an obstacle. Always had been. I managed her life for years, handling everything, while she concerned herself with controlling everyone around her. The accident was a stroke of luck. I didn't plan it, but after it happened, I saw an opportunity. David took a step back, stunned by the coldness in Linda's voice. You kept her in this state for money? For control? Linda looked at him, unblinking. You would never understand. Margaret was a powerful woman, but so am I, and as long as she was trapped in that bed, I had the power. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Linda's raw and unrepentant confession left her speechless. She looked over at Dr. Morgan, expecting some kind of reaction, but the doctor seemed frozen, as if he had already accepted that he had lost. Bill tucked the recorder back into his pocket with a look of triumph. That's enough. That night, Linda, Hastings, and Dr. Morgan were taken into custody. The evidence Bill had gathered, the financial records, the suspicious transactions, and now Linda's confession was enough to incriminate them. David Carter stood in the hallway as the police escorted the two from the house. His gaze was distant, his shoulders weighed down by the truth that had been revealed. Sarah, standing beside him, felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. They had won a terrible battle, but what lay ahead? Margaret, still trapped in her vegetative state, was not yet free of her tormentors. In the days that followed, the adulterated medication was stopped and proper treatment began. Sarah spent long hours by Margaret's side, waiting, hoping. The signs of recovery, though slow, began to show. For the first time in months, Margaret was starting to come back. The morning after Linda Hastings and Dr. Morgan were arrested, the Carter mansion felt lighter, though there was still a lingering sense of emptiness. The absence of the two conspirators was strangely quiet, as if the house itself was adjusting to the impact of their abrupt departure. Sarah Harper was in Margaret's room, sitting by the bed, watching as the woman began her slow recovery. Now that the harmful medication had been stopped, everything depended on how much Margaret's body and mind could recover after all these months. The days that followed were full of uncertainty. Though Margaret had shown small signs of recovery, her progress was slow. Sarah spent hours reading aloud, trying to stimulate her mind, talking to her, and waiting for any response, no matter how small. David Carter, in turn, spent more and more time in his wife's room. Sometimes he would simply sit in the armchair by the bed, watching her with a mixture of hope and guilt. The atmosphere in the house, though relieved by the revelation of the conspiracy, was still heavy with sadness. Bill O'Connor had successfully exposed everything. The fraudulent transactions, the proof that Linda and Dr. Morgan had manipulated Margaret's health to gain control over her fortune. But for David, what remained was the uncertainty of his wife's future and what was left of their family. Days passed, and then one quiet afternoon, something unexpected happened. Sarah was adjusting Margaret's pillows, talking about a newspaper article she had just read, when she felt something different. Margaret's hand, which had remained motionless for so long, lightly squeezed hers. It was a weak grip, but unmistakable. Sarah froze, barely believing what she had felt. She looked at Margaret, her eyes fixed on the patient's face. "Margaret, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. For a moment, nothing happened. But then slowly, Margaret's eyes opened, blinking in the soft light coming through the windows. Sarah stood still, her heart pounding. Margaret Carter was finally waking up. "Margaret?" Sarah repeated, now more firmly, though still in disbelief. Margaret's eyes moved slowly, as if struggling to adjust to the world around her. It was a slow, hesitant movement, but clearly conscious. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she pressed the call button for help. Minutes later, David rushed into the room, nearly stumbling in his haste. When he saw Margaret's open eyes, he froze in his tracks, completely stunned. "Margaret?" His voice cracked with emotion. Margaret's eyes blinked, and then, very slowly, her lips moved, forming words that were barely audible. "David." It was just a whisper, but for David and Sarah, that sound was a miracle. David felt his knees beside the bed, tears welling up in his eyes as he held his wife's hand. I'm here, Margaret. You came back." The days that followed that first sign of life were filled with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. Margaret was conscious but weak. The time she had spent in a vegetative state had taken a toll on her body. She struggled to move, and her words came slowly, with long pauses between them. However, each day she seemed to regain a little more strength. David spent hours at her side, talking about everything that had happened since the accident. He hesitated, though, to tell her the full truth about Linda and Dr. Walker. Sarah knew that moment would have to come, but for now, it was more important for Margaret to focus on her recovery. "You need your strength, Margaret. There's still so much you need to know," David whispered as he held her hand. Margaret, in her moments of lucidity, sensed how much had changed. She felt that there was more going on, something everyone around her was hesitating to tell her. Though her body was still weak, her mind was beginning to process fragmented memories. Bits and pieces of what happened before the accident, her conversations with Dr. Walker, and Linda's strange behavior. Something dark was lurking, but her memory couldn't quite grasp the full truth yet. As Margaret continued to recover, flashes of memories began to surface in her mind. Small fragments of what had happened before the accident and during her time in the vegetative state. She recalled Linda's face in those fragmented memories, always with that calculated, cold look. She remembered conversations with Dr. Walker, insisting that something was wrong with the medications he was prescribing her. But he always reassured her, telling her everything was under control. Now these memories were coming back with frightening clarity. Margaret hadn't spoken much about it yet, but her mind was working, trying to piece together the truth. She knew that something dark had happened, something that had nearly cost her life, and she knew that Linda and Dr. Walker were at the center of it. One morning, while Sarah was helping Margaret with some simple exercises to regain movement, Margaret finally began to speak about what had been weighing on her mind. "Sarah," she said, her voice still weak but firm. I remember some things. Before the accident, I remember Linda. She was different." Sarah stopped for a moment, feeling a chill in her stomach. She knew this moment would come when Margaret would finally start piecing together the fragments of what had happened. "What do you remember, Margaret?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm. "She was always around," Margaret continued, her voice faltering. "Always. Suggesting things. Telling me I should trust Dr. Walker more, that I should let him take care of me. But I started to suspect something wasn't right." Sarah held Margaret's hand tightly. "You're right, Margaret. Something was very wrong, and we found out." Margaret looked at her wide-eyed, her breathing becoming faster. "What did you find out?" That afternoon, Sarah and David decided it was time to tell Margaret the whole truth. She had recovered enough to understand, and the truth could no longer be avoided. David was visibly nervous, pacing back and forth in the room as he tried to find the right words. Margaret, still weak but mentally clear, watched her husband with a worried expression. She knew something important was about to be revealed. David stopped beside the bed, finally gathering the courage to speak. "Margaret, there's something you need to know, something about the accident. And about Linda." The mention of Linda made Margaret's eyes narrow. "What happened, David?" He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of guilt and the truth he had to deliver. "Linda and Dr. Walker, they weren't helping you. They were keeping you in this state. They were manipulating your medications, stealing money. They were trying to control your life, your finances. And when you started to suspect, they kept you in a coma. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret stared at David, disbelief written all over her pale face. She tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. "They're in jail now," Sarah added, trying to soften the blow. "We gathered enough evidence. Bill O'Connor, the investigator, helped expose everything. You're safe now, Margaret, and you're recovering." Margaret looked at Sarah, her breathing unsteady. "Linda, she was like a sister to me. How could she do this?" David knelt beside the bed, tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you." Margaret was silent for a few moments, processing the devastating truth she had just learned. The shock was evident, but there was also a growing anger in her eyes. "I will recover," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I will recover, and I will make them pay for what they've done." Sarah and David exchanged glances, amazed by Margaret's resolve. She was back, not just physically, but with a renewed inner strength. Margaret was determined to reclaim her life and to confront the shadows that had tried to destroy her. The days following the revelation of the betrayal were a mix of recovery and tension in the Carter mansion. Margaret, still regaining her physical strength, showed a fierce determination. Her mind, once fragmented by months of forced sedation, was now clearing. She was weak, yes, but her will to rise again was unstoppable. Each day brought new progress. Sarah Harper watched as this strength emerged while helping Margaret with her daily physical therapy. Every step, every movement, no matter how small, was a victory. But there was something more in Margaret's eyes, something beyond the desire to heal. It was a quiet fury, a thirst for justice that grew stronger each day. "I won't let them destroy what I've built," Margaret said, one of the rare times she openly talked about her feelings. She was sitting in her wheelchair, looking out over the expansive garden she had once ruled with such authority. "Linda and Dr. Walker thought they could bury me. They don't know who I really am." Sarah remained silent, listening to Margaret's harsh words with a mix of admiration and concern. Her strength was palpable. But Sarah knew the emotional recovery would be just as challenging as the physical one. As Margaret fought to regain control of her body, David Carter and Bill O'Connor were busy making the necessary legal preparations to ensure that Linda and Dr. Walker were properly prosecuted. The evidence they had gathered was solid, but both knew that the legal system was slow and complicated. Bill, ever methodical, made sure every detail was perfectly aligned. "They'll pay for this, David," the investigator said firmly as he reviewed the financial and medical reports they had compiled. "Linda and Dr. Walker have no way out, but we need to be ready for a long legal battle. They'll try to defend themselves in every possible way." David, still shaken by Linda's betrayal, was focused on ensuring justice was done. "I won't rest until Margaret is completely free of them," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon as he stood by his wife during her most difficult recovery moments. Margaret's progress was slow but steady. After weeks of intense therapy, she managed to take her first steps on her own. The feeling of her body responding again to her commands was like a shot of life into her soul. Although she was weak, she was no longer the lost woman who had been at the mercy of others. One afternoon, as Sarah helped Margaret prepare for a short walk in the garden, Margaret stopped abruptly. "Sarah," she said with unusual seriousness, "I need to know everything. Not just about what happened while I was in a coma. I need to know where Linda is, how she was able to do this, and what else is hidden. I have the right to know." Sarah took a deep breath. She knew this moment was coming. Since Linda and Dr. Walker's arrest, many details had been kept from Margaret to avoid overwhelming her. But now, Margaret was strong enough, and her determination, unshakable. Bill managed to gather evidence that Linda was diverting large sums of money from your accounts to a personal one, Sarah began, choosing her words carefully. She was manipulating everything, Margaret. Your investments, your properties. She had full control over your financial life while you were incapacitated. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Her eyes, once fiery with anger, were now fixed on a distant point in the garden as she processed the depth of the betrayal. "And David?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Sarah hesitated. She knew that David, though well-meaning, had trusted Linda blindly, allowing her to take control of everything. David didn't know the extent of what was happening, Margaret. He trusted her, just like you did. Linda was very good at hiding what she was doing. Margaret nodded slowly, the pain visible in her expression. I trusted her. How could I have been so blind? You weren't blind, Margaret. She was manipulative, and she did everything in a calculated way. Now that we know the truth, we can act, Sarah said, trying to reassure her. Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze steely. I will act, and I won't stop until everything that belongs to me is restored. Linda thought she could bury me, but she failed. The following days marked a new phase in Margaret's recovery, not just physical but emotional. David, aware of his wife's fierce determination, began to open up more to her, revealing details he had previously avoided sharing. Margaret, in turn, began to accept the help she had once rejected, allowing David and Sarah to stand by her side as she faced the emotional scars that remained. The reunion between Margaret and the legal team handling her recovery was filled with emotions. Bill O'Connor had arranged a meeting with Margaret's legal representatives so she could understand all the steps being taken against Linda and Dr. Walker. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. The financial recovery will be slow, Margaret, one of the lawyers said. But with the evidence we've gathered, we're confident we can recover most of what was lost. Margaret looked at him with a firm expression, though her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. It's not just about the money. It's about what they took from me. My life, the months I lost, that will never be restored. David, sitting beside her, held her hand. We'll get through this together, no matter how long it takes. Although Linda and Dr. Walker were in custody, the final chapter was yet to come. The trial. Bill O'Connor remained in constant contact with the prosecutors, laying the groundwork for when Linda would be confronted with her crimes. Margaret knew that seeing Linda Hastings again would be one of the hardest moments of her life, but it would also be the key to closing this dark chapter. When the day of Linda's first hearing arrived, Margaret insisted on being present. Sarah and David supported her, but both were worried about the emotional toll it would take on her. However, Margaret was adamant. I need to see this with my own eyes, she said. The courtroom was silent as Linda was brought in. She looked different, worn down. The air of control and arrogance that once surrounded her was gone. Her eyes, however, still held a glint of defiance. When she met Margaret's gaze, there was a deadly silence in the room. Margaret remained composed. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many questions burning in her mind, but she knew that now was not the time. All she needed was justice, and that would be her greatest revenge. Months passed since the trial of Linda Hastings and Dr. Walker began, and although the legal battle was far from over, Margaret began to feel her life returning to her control. The process of recovery, physical, emotional, and legal, had been long and painful, but Margaret refused to let herself be defined by what had been taken from her. With David and Sarah by her side, she was slowly rebuilding her life, step by step. One afternoon, while walking slowly through the mansion's garden, Margaret paused for a moment and looked around. The place that had once felt like a prison now seemed like a symbol of her survival. She had gone through hell, but she was back, stronger, more determined, and more aware of her own strength. She turned to Sarah, who was walking beside her. You stood by me every step of the way. Thank you. Sarah smiled, her eyes gleaming with pride. You didn't need me, Margaret. The strength was always there. You just needed time to find it again. Margaret nodded, looking once more at the vastness around her. She was no longer silent, no longer trapped, and whatever came next, she was ready to face it head on. Months had passed since Linda Hastings and Dr. Walker had been sentenced. The legal battle had been long and exhausting, but justice had been served. Margaret Carter had not only survived the ordeal, but had come out stronger than anyone could have imagined. The once quiet and oppressive Carter mansion had begun to show signs of life again, no longer burdened by the darkness that had once consumed it. With Linda and Dr. Walker behind bars, Margaret's focus turned to rebuilding what had been taken from her. Not just financially, but emotionally. Her health had improved steadily, and though the physical scars of her time in the coma would always remain, her spirit had become unbreakable. David Carter, now freed from the burden of guilt and secrets, had renewed his dedication to his wife. He no longer carried the weight of doubt or deception, and his relationship with Margaret, though scarred, was healing with time. Together, they were learning to move forward, day by day. Sarah Harper, who had been an unwavering source of support for Margaret, began to think about her own future. Her role in uncovering the conspiracy and helping Margaret through her recovery had transformed her. She was no longer just a nurse. She had become a trusted confidant and a protector. But with Margaret's life returning to some semblance of normalcy, Sarah realized it might be time for her to pursue new challenges. One morning, while Margaret was out in the garden, Sarah approached her. Margaret was seated on a bench, enjoying the fresh air and the view of the garden, which had once seemed like a symbol of her entrapment, but now represented her freedom. "Margaret," Sarah began, her voice steady but thoughtful. "I've been thinking. It might be time for me to move on." Margaret turned to her, surprised but understanding. "Move on? What do you mean, Sarah?" Sarah smiled softly. "You're doing so well now. You've come so far, and you have David by your side. I've been with you through the hardest parts, but I think it's time for me to find my next path." Margaret's eyes softened. She knew this moment would come. "I don't know how I would have made it without you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "You've been more than a nurse to me, Sarah. You're family now." Sarah felt a wave of emotion but held herself steady. "I'll never forget everything we've been through. But I think I need to help others now. People who might be going through something similar. I've learned so much here, and I feel like it's time for a new chapter." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with admiration. "You're going to be incredible, wherever you go. But promise me, you'll visit. This house won't be the same without you." Sarah smiled, feeling the warmth of Margaret's words. "Of course, I'll visit. You can't get rid of me that easily." As the two women sat together in the quiet of the garden, there was a sense of closure. Margaret had reclaimed her life, and Sarah had found her strength and purpose in the process. Both had been through a journey that tested them in unimaginable ways, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. The Carter mansion, once a place filled with secrets and shadows, was now a home again. The storms had passed, and in their wake, Margaret, David, and Sarah stood as survivors, united by their shared struggle and hopeful for they. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is made with dedication and care, aiming to touch the heart of the listener. If this narrative stirred something in you, consider subscribing so we can continue on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is crucial for us to continue sharing these unique experiences. Stay safe, and we'll meet in the next story, future that lay ahead.